Welcome, Impactful Parents. It's time for the Impactful Parenting Podcast, where I give you parenting tips and resources to make you a more impactful parent to your school-age child. I am your host, Kristina Campos. Connection with their adolescent. I'm a mom of four, a teacher that's taught every grade from preschool through high school. And today I help moms and dads like yourself to navigate that exhausting, confusing, frustrating, but rewarding world of parenting. So welcome to the Impactful Parent. And today I have a special guest. His name is Dr. Steve Rando. And Dr. Steve is founder of Axon EEG Solutions. And he helps parents stop the guessing game with their teenager health by using objective brain mapping data. I'm really excited to talk to him about this because he challenges the standard of the trial and error approach that so many of us have been through with medication, and helps families realize that their broken teen might actually be a high-performing brain after all, and just in the wrong environment. So he helps parents stop that medication guessing game, and I'm truly excited to have him on. This might be the episode that you've been praying about, parents, especially if you've been asking, why isn't therapy working? Because this episode will be a game changer. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Steve.
Yeah, so we've been at this now since about 2009, and over this time, it's definitely evolved. We started, on sort of a small scale, and now we're up to probably about 50,000 brain scans. So needless to say, we've learned a lot of information over that time, and I think extrapolating it into parenting is quite possibly my favorite area of doing this. It's kind of like picking your favorite kid. It's hard to know, which part of this is your favorite, but it's a fun journey. And I think when we take the guessing out of it, it really can be a game changer.
We have so many parents struggling with their teens' behaviors, and the medication guessing game that we were talking about. This is a stressful mess for a lot of parents. Yeah. So I want to start today with a brief overview of what you do, and maybe that's a success story of what's happened.
Gosh, I could tell you so many stories, but I mean, there's a beautiful one that I can think of someone who was elementary school age that we had done a scan on, and looked like kind of ADHD type tendencies. And I said, hey, you have a little creative artist here with ADHD patterns. Like, what's going on? And so I said, oh, well, I didn't know that. They just have some problems with like homework after school and so forth. And I said, well, why don't we try to, think about it as we get into middle school, maybe we could look at, experiential learning school, Waldorf school, some sort of other setting that could get this kid a little more hands-on. And I said, why don't we, other strategies as far as environmental support. And it really, not a lot happened between then and sort of middle school. But then once middle school came, it was like, okay, now we need tutors, now we need summer school, and now we need all these other things. And it was like, okay, what if we could do that in third grade for everybody and start to, funnel them into these different settings? And I think it would make parents' jobs easier, teachers' jobs easier. We'd have better test scores. I mean, it's not an answer for everything, but geez, if we didn't have to guess, it would be so much easier,
No, knowledge is so much power, and that's exactly what you're giving people. So it's very, very special.
And sometimes it's when it's what's not there too. So, I mean, we've seen situations where people come in, like psychotics coming in from, other states. They come in and try to get these evaluations because nothing's worked. And I remember a time we looked at a scan and I said, hey, this looks pretty normal. Like why is this person here? They wouldn't have flown across the country to come here, for this. And so the absence of information can be very helpful too. And in that situation, I remember vividly just telling the group, I said, hey, this looks like a pretty, unremarkable scan. Why don't we look, neck down? Why don't we see if there's something else going on? And sure enough, we looked at the immune system and found that they had these, what's called autoimmune antibodies. And we treated that, and the person went on to go live a totally normal life. I mean, have kids, and it was just a wonderful story. And we've presented on that case a number of times. But it's the absence of information that can tell us too that, like, hey, your kid might be presenting as they're depressed, but we don't see it here in the scan. So what's up? What's up? And then they tell you, oh yeah, I was abused. I didn't tell anybody. Like I've had children now because that's happened multiple times where we've seen that. Even adults, 65 years old, your brain doesn't look like you're depressed, but you clearly are. Like, what's up? Oh yeah, my husband abuses me. I never told anybody, So it can open up these conversations when you bring data to the table, and it doesn't have to be, so subjective. The interesting part of this is that a lot of families find this sort of work in the last 10% of energy that they have left. And what we want to change it is to do it in the beginning, do it before the kids struggle, do it when we're realizing their strengths and leveraging their strengths rather than catching them on the tail end of a, substance use issue or self-harm or any of the other things you've talked about in any of your other shows. And so we want to catch them early. So yeah, there's definitely quite a few stories out there. And I really think that, if we're intentional about it, no pun intended, but if we're intentional or impactful about this with what we're doing and using the data, it doesn't have to be a guessing game anymore, and perhaps we even get to a place where we can do this before medications become on the table, becomes something that we're talking about.
For a parent who has watched their teen try different prescriptions with no success, how does this brain mapping change that experience from guessing to knowing?
I mean, we definitely are using this to help guide information and help guide what we're doing. But I think what a lot of people don't understand about mental health in general is, we go through this process of having symptoms. Our children present with symptoms, and we show up at the office and we think that the diagnosis is going to be the answer. But oftentimes it's just the beginning of the conversation around giving language to the behaviors. Okay. And so, we categorize that, we do a really good job of it. And that's what, that's what we're doing by having the labels, but it doesn't tell us anything about how that person's going to respond. And frankly, most providers don't understand that the diagnosis really tells us very little about whether a person's going to respond to treatment or not. And so it's sort of a, kind of a mind-blowing thing that, for me, back when I first started my career was how mental health is practiced in the first place. And so I remember sitting down with a young psychiatrist at the time. This probably would have been in the early 2000s. And at that time, I'd been working a lot in autism and, like I said, developmental disorders. And we were looking at biomarkers around autism and trying to predict how kids and if kids would respond to treatments. And so we were in these big think tanks, all over, lots of us in different disciplines and so forth. But every treatment stemmed from a biomarker, something we could measure in a lab, some fluid that we took from a kid and imaging, something like that. And we could predict how they would respond or if they would respond. But when it comes to mental health, we don't do that. And it's the only profession in the medical community that doesn't have a test for what they're actually trying to treat. But people don't understand that. And they think that, okay, if I just get the diagnosis right, that'll tell us what we need to do. That'll help my kid who's depressed, or that'll help my kid with ADHD or whatever. And so I'm sitting down with the psychiatrist and I said, we were forming this practice that exists now. This was back in the early 2000s. And I said, how do you guys know what treatment to do? And I were just kind of casually, was on the couch, probably drinking coffee. And I said, how do you know what to do? He says, well, we just sort of listen to them, and maybe they'll have a questionnaire. And, after the questionnaire, it might narrow down the diagnosis. And then from there, we pick treatments based on what's standard of care for that label. And I said, well, you don't have like a test or any sort of marker that, like which treatment is going to work and which isn't. And so at that time it was, I was doing work in developmental pediatrics. I'd been around that community for a while, but like when it was articulated that way, it just sort of blew my mind. I was like, how do we practice this way? It's really wild. So we went on and started scanning kids and adults and looking at these markers and trying to make sense of what people were experiencing. So it's been a long journey over the years, but it's definitely come a long ways. And so we started using brain scans in residential addiction centers. This was for youth 17 to 24. We were doing brain scans on them to kind of help gather some objective data. At that time, this was sort of an interesting situation where we had a lot of kids coming in to the center and asking for stimulant medications. My prescriber in California gives me Adderall, and so in those centers, they're sort of notorious for kind of bad paperwork and not having information. So, everyone's left sort of scratching their heads. What do we do? This kid says that he gets Adderall at home. So I said, what if we take the scans and look to see if that looks like a kid who actually might respond to a stimulant medication. So we did that and became a routine test, sort of a screener that would guide the providers to look for, if this would work. And so we quickly started to realize that there was a lot of information that we saw beyond just, are they going to respond to a stimulant or not, or would they likely, would that likely be a good treatment? We could go on to predict, what substances people might be in for before they even told us. Okay, so that was pretty interesting. We could look and start to leverage strengths, which is probably my favorite thing to talk about now. But when we started to see these things, we're like, there's a whole bigger story that's being told here that like words and labels by themselves aren't giving us, and so that's kind of how it all unfolded, probably in the early 2000s. And we've really never looked back since. Now it's just trying to bring this out to, to the masses.
I love this new approach because it's just, we need a new approach.
Yeah.
We've been doing this so painstakingly painful for so long when parents are trying to help their child and they don't know what to do. Like, this sounds like such a great alternative for those who can explore it. I know one of the biggest fears for parents is the side effects of the psychiatric meds,
right.
So how can looking at the brain's electrical patterns help us predict which medications might actually make a teen's symptoms worse or better for that matter? Wow, that's just amazing to me. How does that happen?
Yeah, fascinating question. In fact, depending on how many hours we have, we could talk about this stuff for a long time. But where we really got interested the most in clinical utility, this is now stepping outside of the residential addiction centers, was looking at treatment failures. And so there was, this is sort of pre-AI when, we'd have to put these patterns together in our heads and keep track of it on spreadsheets and so forth. And so we were noticing over and over people coming in who had reported multiple treatment failures. They'd be on multiple medications, or maybe they were already on multiple medications, some uppers, some downers. And you're like, how did you get to this place where you're, effectively drinking Red Bull and vodka all day? It just doesn't make sense. And so we're looking at these patterns and we're starting to notice, and this is how my brain works. It's just like everything is patterns and numbers. So we're looking at these patterns, and there's a couple that just keep showing up over and over. And when you see those, it was sort of a red flag of like, ooh, we need to be careful with this one. They're likely not going to, to respond to treatment, even though they look anxious, or they look like they have ADHD, or they look depressed. Their brain tells a different story. And so that was kind of early in the journey too, again, before we sort of aggregated all this data and could be able to process it on a large scale and then see what actually works. Okay. So we don't want to, at that time, we'd sort of talk about this in conversations and in our collaboration and so forth about treatment failures. But now we talk more about, what can we do about it? Because we know so much more obviously than we did. But yeah, the treatment failure patterns are sort of half empty, half full. That's sort of the easier part of it, is to see who won't respond to treatment. It's a little bit more difficult to predict who will respond to treatment. So it's not as easy as just doing a scan and looking at a pattern and saying, hey, take this med. There's more to it, and I'm sure we'll get into it. But it starts to tell a story. It tells a story of, what sort of ecosystem this person would thrive in, what sort of symptoms they might present with if they're not in that ecosystem. And then we can start thinking about, what sort of treatments might be efficacious, for a brain like that. But yeah, it really started with a lot of who doesn't respond to medications. And when we see that, if you could just sit here for a day, I do thousands of these, a month. If you could just sit here and see over and over the stories of people who just aren't responding to treatment, and then you see, oh, there's one of the treatment failure patterns, and it's like just over and over, and so that's really what our work is trying to get that out there and validate it and prove it, so that we don't have to see these people suffering from year after year before they get to a place where they have $100 left and no energy, and they're like, if this doesn't work, I'm done. This is it.
Along the same lines, you've said that a broken teen might actually just be a high-performance brain in the wrong environment. So I kind of like to know, what does a high-performance brain look like on a map? Yeah. Why does it so often get mislabeled as a disorder instead?
I've worked in so many different niche groups, and it's been such a privilege and honor to work with all these different groups through our partnerships in different settings. And so we have partner clinics who utilize our services all over the world, and they bring connections to different organizations, whether it be, Hollywood, or whether it be first responders, or whether it be professional athletes, whatever it is. And so we can look at all this data and sort of trend it and look for commonalities. And what's really fascinating is, I think where some of these connections started to be made was when I was in two worlds, seemingly sort of unrelated at the same time. And so I was in this world of substance use disorders, working with these 17 to 25-year-olds, I was saying, looking at hundreds of brains, everyone coming through, and looking at basically how people were sort of self-soothing or self-medicating through their substance use. And then I was looking at professional racing drivers, seemingly unrelated worlds, but I would look at these scans of professional racing drivers. So my children for quite a while were into competitive motorsports. And so they used to race go-karts. And it's a highly competitive, very tense, very stressful, lots of challenges in karting. And so we were studying brains and studying what makes a good racing driver, and what makes a world champion. And so we would start to look at these nuances of that through sport and other sports as well. But motorsports was really my interest at the time. And one day I had a kid come in. His dad had brought him in off the street. He was homeless and he was on meth. And we did a scan on him. But I also had a professional racing driver that day that we were reviewing the scan. And I looked at those. And again, remember, this is before AI. This is before, we could trend all these patterns. And I looked at the two of them and I said, I can't tell the difference between who is who here. Who's the kid on meth, and who's the professional racing driver? And they look very similar. And so, we started to think about these things like as in the form of unmet needs. Like, okay, in this situation, you have a guy who, his parents likely committed a lot of time, a lot of money to motorsports and helping bring up a kid through those channels. Then you have someone else who may have been exposed to drugs, trauma, abuse, neglect, whatever it was, in a sort of self-medicating through substance use. And on the other hand, we have someone, driving around a track at 50, 60 miles an hour in a go-kart every day, And so basically, if, the same brain patterns, they're scratching the same sort of itches, but in different ways. And so that's where we started to think about these ideas as unmet needs, and how do we help individuals identify those sooner and help parents support those needs in ways that are practical. So we don't go and look for it, or our kids don't go and look for it on their own. We give them a big toolbox and we say, hey, you're bored, go in the toolbox. You're feeling sad, go in the toolbox, instead of maybe doing something they saw on TikTok, or some maladaptive behavior they saw their parents do, or whatever. So yeah, it really came down to recognizing those patterns and then saying, okay, what's the unmet need in this situation and how can we help them?
And what does it look like if a parent's listening to this and they're resonating with what you're saying, and they're like, I got one of those kids and I would love to find this out for even more, or maybe even for themselves. Like, why am I this way? Why can't I not, give something up, or whatever it is that they, they're having trouble with? What does this process look like if they want to reach out to you?
We function as a lab. So we're a lab, just like it would be, or get your blood drawn or get, an X-ray. We function like that. And so what we're trying to do is get more providers to bring on these services, so that you don't have to guess anymore. You go see a therapist and this becomes a routine thing that you do. You go see a psychiatrist, you do a sports physical, and this is part of what you do. And so that's what we're trying to change. We have partnerships all over the country and all over the world where people can go and get scans. But ultimately, I think the idea is changing the paradigm, taking the book, taking that to the providers and saying, hey, this is something I think we should try. I don't want to guess at medications again. I don't want to guess at another therapy, And when you can look at these brain scans and you can see that, depression shows up a dozen different ways, and ADHD shows up a dozen different ways, and panic attacks, and all the rejection sensitivity and pathological demand avoidance and all these new fancy labels we have, they show up many different ways in the scan. You can't unsee that. Once you see that, it's like, how do we ever how does it ever work? I mean, that's the question I always wonder, is how do we ever guess right? Because there's so much variability and heterogeneity in these labels. And oftentimes, especially the families who are kind of struggling, it's usually not one pattern that's driving the symptoms. It's a cluster of patterns. So you may have some ADHD patterns, but you may have some, depression patterns in there too. And so when you put these together, it's kind of like whack-a-mole, right? And you're trying to figure out like which one am I trying to hit now? Well, we got the ADHD under control, but now they're not sleeping. So now we got to go do that one, And so it's kind of one of those things. Someone else had mentioned this to me a couple of weeks ago. It's like one of these like duh moments, like why aren't we just doing this routinely? It's so, it just is such common sense once you start to look at it,
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned that the parents are most likely dealing with several issues at the same time, because I don't think we talk about that. We just assume that there's one underlying problem, and if we fix that, and then it's going to be great. When really there's probably most likely layers to whatever you're dealing with in your life, just like everything else. It's probably all not that simple. We're not that lucky, but I'm glad you mentioned that. And another thing that you mentioned that I want to bring up is your book. Because you said to take the book to your doctor and start having these discussions with your doctor about this type of treatment. In your book, it's called Think Like a Brain. Mm-hmm. And you highlight in there actually how children react when they see their own brain map. So how does seeing an objective picture of their brain help a teenager stop feeling crazy or even lazy, which I'm sure they feel like, and start feeling empowered because now their parent has bought this book, they know the information, and hopefully they're taking it to their doctor. So what do you get from that?
Yeah, the validation is such a big thing. And, again, a lot of this I owe to the early work working in substance use centers. But, seeing those kids come in, a lot of them coming from really sort of privileged families. These are expensive centers to be at. They're not just there hanging out. They're there, it's a big expense and a big commitment, and sometimes multiple centers, that they've been through. And so we get these scans and they would come in and we would see that, oh, look at this substance that they're using does to the brain exactly what their brain looks like it needs. You know what I'm saying? Like alcohol, people don't drink alcohol whose brains don't need alcohol. And I know that sounds like a funny statement, but what the effect is of the substance, we'll say THC. Okay. This was a big problem in those centers before it became sort of diffuse all over, especially in Colorado. But a lot of kids coming in there for THC. And you would see these patterns in the brain that when they use it, sort of quote unquote, like normalizes their brain patterns. It's like, oh, okay. Like they're just trying to make themselves feel normal. Okay. And I think normal is a charged word because there really isn't really a normal brain pattern. I think what normal is abnormal in a fitting environment. Okay. And when those two things align, that's when you have someone who's successful. That's when you have someone who realizes their gifts. But to try to make anyone's brain look like normal is really sort of a fallacy. And I think it would really do us a disservice if we were trying to do that as a society. But nonetheless, we have these brains coming in and we're talking to these parents. Oftentimes parents, one's in New York, one's in California, one's on a plane, who knows, whatever. But I'm trying to explain to them that, like, look, it was hard because you were trying to treat patterns that don't respond well to medications. They're not intuitive for parenting, okay? It's really easy. It's really easy to raise, like think of this like a dog, okay? If you have like a golden retriever, okay? Not all golden retrievers are obviously easy to raise, but they're just, you sort of know what they need. But now someone hands you a Husky and they say, here, I want you to take care of this puppy, okay? And then all of a sudden, the things that work for the retriever is not working for the Husky. You leave the Husky alone in your house and it's chewing up shoes, it's running around, it's yelling outside, it's jumping the fence, it's doing all these crazy things. The dog, though, isn't the problem. It's the dog in that environment. If you have the playbook for a Husky, you'd know what to do, And so I used to live in Arizona, and if we took our Huskies down to Arizona, which we have, they're miserable. You take them, they're hot, they don't want to play, they don't want to run around because they got 2 jackets on and it's hot outside, But we bring them back to the mountains and we let them play in the snow. We can't get them to come inside. It's the same dog, okay? It's just a different environment, okay? So coming back to the question, we would take these scans. We'd have parents, on the calls and the kids and so forth and the therapist. And it just, to me, it felt so validating to like say like, oh, this is why it was so hard when I would tell him to go upstairs, get his shoes, get his coat, and meet me in the car, and he would be upstairs playing with his Legos. It wasn't disobedience. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't, he's not listening. It wasn't hormones. Like his brain's like literally wired to take one command at a time. And when I gave him 3 or 4, that doesn't work. Okay, how are we going to change that? Okay. And so I think the key of that, like the one word answer, is just validation. It's validating for why this parenting strategy didn't work, why this therapy strategy, and why the medications. And frankly, I mean, bigger picture is the within the marriage too. I mean, imagine if we had this information to understand about our own blind spots or our own, partnering strategies, how much easier it could be. Like if I have a brain pattern that shuts down under load and my child has one, how do you think those conversations are going to go when you come to the table with 5 problems? Did you fill out the college scholarship stuff? Did you do your homework? How come you didn't do the chores? You came home late. Like there's no way. If they have one of those shutdown patterns, that's not going to happen. You're just going to be butting heads. And then that just creates this whole ripple effect. But if we understand our brain patterns, we can set up these ecosystems where Huskies can thrive, But if you keep trying to take them to Arizona and say, why isn't this working? You're just going to be, you're going to end up on medications, or, you end up in the shelter, which is, full of Huskies right now,
Oh, I love that so much. Very well articulated. I want a mic drop. It was such a good, it was just really well spoken on how this could help parents. And I know that a lot of parents, it's hard to tell what is normal teen moodiness and what is a functional brain imbalance, So would you say that are there any specific like brain signature so that parents should look for that suggests it's time to stop waiting and guessing and start reaching out for help with you?
On one hand, I think that having objective information at the table is always a good thing, to take away the guesswork, to understand how my kid's brain responds to criticism, for example, or, pressure in sports, or, different sort of situations, so that we don't, we only have a short window with our kids where we're raising them. And it's like the majority of it is as adulthood. So if we can understand them early and help them have tools, through stress and through, relationships and all these sort of things. And what do I do when I'm bored? If we can help understand them and give them those tools, it could just have such an exponential change generationally down the road. I mean, substance use, all kinds of things. So, it's really a challenging question, because obviously I'm biased. I mean, I think we should just be scanning for everybody and having that objective data to lead these conversations with, how do I teach this kid in school, and what sport do I pick? Do I do baseball or do we do hockey? Do we, what do we do, before the time runs out and we end up they're teenagers and they don't want to, listen. But I do think that when the dishes are easy to make, it's intuitive, right? If it's like, this is a garden variety ADHD, we give them a stimulant or do ADHD types of treatments. And I'm not married to medications. In fact, I don't really care what the treatment is. I just want it to match the patterns. So those are easy. It's when we either have trepidation about going on a medication, maybe it's an SSRI and we're worried about suicidal ideation. Yeah, that's very reasonable. Maybe we should bring some objective data to the table. If it's easy, we don't generally meet those people. It's the ones that aren't. We tried multiple medications, or we tried these therapy strategies, or it seems to be ambiguous. And I think again, it lends itself to the map that we're trying to use to guide these treatments. And it's nobody. There's no shortage of effort. Okay, the providers they get into this because they want to help people. The parents are generally trying to do the best that they can. It's just without the data driving the conversations, it's really challenging. And so we go, this one treatment didn't work, so I'm going to go over here. And this treatment didn't work, and I'm going to go over here. And pretty soon we have a whole bunch of cooks in the kitchen, and we don't really know, what's the actual recipe that we're working with. So, yeah, it's it's a funny conversation, but I think there's utility on so many different levels to help and not wait.
You are a dad yourself, and you know you're going through this process. At what point did you realize that you have an amazing parenting tool right here that you're working on? When did it become a parenting tool for you?
Yeah, that was a good question. So fortunately, my family has been so compliant with all of my experimentations over the years. And so we've scanned our kids, and my wife and I've done a million of them over the years. And so when we first started, my boys were probably 4 and 5 at the time, which is kind of the earliest that we would start, gathering data like that. And I would start to see these patterns and trends in my boys. And I was like, oh, this isn't like, I can't believe this is real. Am I doing something wrong? I was sort of scratching my head, like is even what I'm doing like valid? Like, what is this, And because it didn't make sense. The story I was seeing on the paper wasn't the kid I saw, and it was like, okay, maybe it's just because they're young. And then as they started to get older, we started to have, regular sibling rivalry and other sort of things that kind of come up as kids get older. And we came back to the reports and started leveraging the reports that we had done, or the scans on the kids, and supporting them accordingly. And so there's such good troopers about it. But one of the really standout moments was, I told you we were studying racing drivers. And so my kids were racers, toured all over the country, and we were crazy into racing. And one day I pulled the plug on racing. I said, we can't do this anymore. It's too toxic of a culture. It was too stressful for me. And I mean, frankly, it costs so much money. And so I was like, I'm not doing this, anymore. And it was really hard. It was a very hard decision to make. Within a couple of, maybe a month, we started to see a bunch of behaviors. The boys were fighting a lot. We're having lots of conflict, lots of issues. And I'm on a walk with my wife one day, and I said, well, what is going on? Like, what are we going to do with my older boy? He was just being so mean to my younger boy. And, what are we going to do? And it just hit me. I was like, hold on a second. We went from driving around the racetrack 4 times a week, maybe more, all year round. We'd travel doing this. He was going 50, 60 miles an hour to nothing, to no stimulation, no, risky outlets, like none of that. And I said, well, we need to get him into sports, like something else right now. And so we signed him up for soccer, a couple other things. And one thing sort of led to another. And it was like all the behaviors went away. And again, I don't want to boil something down to brothers beating themselves up to something as easy as signing up for soccer, but it was such an aha moment. And we're like, oh, we need to create this ecosystem for our boys that helps them. We can't just pull the plug on this thing, just like a substance. You can't just take alcohol away or THC away and expect that they're just going to be sober. Like, something is going to fill that role. And it may be healthy, sure, it may be running or something else, but it's predictable. Okay. And so you can't just pull the plug. And so what we did with the boys is, in the interest of time, I'll tell you the shorter story, is that, with my older boy, we put all of our eggs in the basket of music. And I said, I'm going to build you a music studio. Okay. And we built him this killer music studio and gave him, all the bells and whistles. We got him into lessons and sessions and all this stuff. And, this was at 7, and now he's 13. He's played, Mission Ballroom. He's been on stage at Red Rocks, but all these places. And it's not because he's like some savant or whatever. I mean, he makes great music, but it's because we create an ecosystem where a Husky can thrive, and it's like, when you see that, and certainly the earlier we do it, probably the easier is my guess, but it just makes it so much more where, kids aren't looking for ways to get their needs met in ways that maybe we don't like, so it's like, hey, I'm bored. Great. Go make music. I'm bored. Hey, go cut some vocals for this other track, or, hop on a call with so-and-so. And so that's what we would do. And, we did the same thing with my other boy with his art and his sports. And it's like, we're not some superhuman parents, but we're not guessing, it's not guessing. It's just, how do you lead them to this place where, where their needs are met? And we're not just trying to do what I did because that was fun. It was fun for me. So let's sign him up for this sport because I like to do that, and it's like, how much of that is if that trial and error is going to work before they're just like, Dad, baseball's not for me. That might be your thing, So,
yes, it costs a lot to do the trial and error too.
We're this trying to get a square peg in a round hole. Like, if their patterns don't align with that activity or your methods, how much friction is that going to create between the parent and the kid too, where you're trying to get them to do something that maybe isn't really their best, for their best interest. It's maybe something more for you, So, but again, it doesn't have to be guesswork. You can look at that and say, hey, this is a good fit for this sport or that sport or whatever, and then try to lead them to that, on their own.
Well, pun intended. This seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah,
I mean, so then why is this not used universally all over? I just don't get it.
Yeah, it's definitely a head scratcher. I think the reason is because the field of qEEG analysis in EEG. I think the issue is that it's unclear who takes the lead. Okay, is this neurology? Is this psychiatry? Is it the therapist? Like, who is it? Okay, and for a lot of years, there's some brilliant minds in the field. It's been stuck in this sort of box, okay, and what I call guru medicine, where they had all these little gurus kind of doing their thing, and people would learn from the gurus, and they would go off and do their thing, and they would say, oh no, this means this, and this means this. But I think it's been such a serendipitous time of AI, love it or hate it, coming together and being able to group large clusters of data and saying, hey, this is actually what we're seeing. This is the truth, okay? Over here, yeah, you may see that, but this is actually how the data shakes out. So it's slowly getting pulled out of the field where it stayed for so long, which tends to be in like the neurotherapy, neuromodulation, and neurofeedback world. And we've pulled it out of that world purposefully to try to get out of some of these like clicks and dysregulation and really lack of kind of like who's taken the lead on this stuff, and bring it into the conversation of mainstream mental health. And so I think that's part of the challenge is, one who takes the lead, and, having people all varying degrees of backgrounds, kind of spearheading some of these early efforts. I think the other issue becomes this issue around normative databases. And so that's a long conversation, but much like things like with blood work and other lab testing, there's normative ranges, okay? When it comes to brain data, that isn't as clear, okay? And I think this is where we talk a lot about the Husky in the desert scenario, is that you can have aberrant patterns. It doesn't mean you have ADHD. It means in a non-supportive environment, these aberrant patterns can look like ADHD symptoms or can look like depression symptoms, you see? And so that's where I think there's been a lot of friction between trying to take brain scan data and put it into the DSM, which is how we diagnose mental health disorders, and saying, oh, well, I scanned all these kids with ADHD and they have a whole bunch of different patterns, so this test doesn't work. It's like, no. I'm telling you, that's the problem with the DSM, is that there's a whole bunch of different patterns over here and we're all calling it ADHD. And so there's got to be some unity around that. So I think those are probably some of the two key areas, and who takes the lead and how do we have this sort of shared language. So we hope to get there, though. We're publishing regularly on this to help, kind of bring the field together and, try to transform the way that these two fields, kind of talk.
And if people are resonating, I know people are listening to this and saying, where do I go? What do I do? What do I do? So let's start with the book. Where do we get your book at so we could learn more about that? And again, the book is Think Like a Brain. Mm-hmm. Where is it? What's inside? Tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, so thinklikeabrain.com. That's a project. It took probably almost 2 years, but it was really a whole lifetime of work in there. Story of a number of situations where people have struggled, and things that we've heard, over the years, and just again bringing objective data to the table to try to help and transform people's care. But yeah, I mean, really the idea is that we've been working off this subjective system. The providers are doing the best with the tools that they have, but it's not working, and we definitely see academia going this way, research going this way, that we've got to pull in objective data to these conversations. Okay. And so that's what the book goes on to talk about. And then we have later in the book, around chapter 8, we have tools and strategies and so forth to try to, bring this to your everyday life. And then ultimately, help with your provider, leverage these scans as well. So yeah, it's been a journey, and it's really exciting to sort of get that out there now and to talk to people about it and not be so theoretical at this point.
And if we get some very, very fortunate listeners who do have the finances to be able to go to you. Is there a way to go directly to you at all and inquire about more, or is the best path truly the other way?
Yeah. And so, ultimately, I mean, this is one of the other things that kind of makes this, kind of again, no pun intended, but a no-brainer, is that scans aren't that expensive. I mean, EEG scans are relatively affordable. They're easy to deliver. I mean, I've done these all over the place, in the weirdest of places. We've done scans. You can do them almost anywhere. It doesn't take long. It's very easy and painless. It's not like some of the other scans that take dyes and you have to go sit in a machine or, whatever. So we have clinics all over the place. And so people can reach out to us at Axon EEG Solutions.com. And so we can try to connect you with providers in your area. And so, I mean, I think that's kind of the easiest way to get started and to, try to leverage that data. But ultimately, I'd love to have it where we could just, it's in everybody's backyard, but it's going to take some time. I mean, it's an old system, and we're still diagnosing people the same way Abraham Lincoln was diagnosed in the 1830s. So it's going to take a little while. It may not be in my lifetime, but, we'll see.
Oh, I hope so. I hope this takes off, because it sounds like an amazing resource for parents. And that's what we're here for at The Impactful Parent. And one last question to you.
Sure.
That I'd like to ask all of my guests, because you are on the Impactful Parenting podcast. And so how do we become an impactful parent, depending on the topic that we're talking about today? And my question to you for my impactful parent question is there one thing that a parent can do tonight, or to start thinking like a brain when they interact with their struggling teenager? What would you tell them to do so they can be an impactful parent also?
The best way to think about it is in the context of unmet needs. Okay. And so behaviors are just a check engine light for unmet needs. And if you can recognize the behavior as not something that we need to change, but maybe an ecosystem that we need to change, and it's just a sign of that, you can start to think about how might I curate an environment where this behavior would be great, would be a superpower, and so when you start to see that, like shutting down under load, or, I'm bored and I need my screens, or I'm having a lot of negative self-talk, or, or they're using a substance or something like that, we have to start to think about what's the underlying unmet need. And so you don't need a scan to do that. You can start to understand that through just inquiring, and start to understand that that's the underlying issue. And if we can leverage systems that support those needs, we can hopefully change that so that it doesn't become, a problem. So what role is the video game serving? What role is the sugar, cravings solving, or, the naughty behavior, or whatever it is? And so if you start to look at that as a need that needs to be met, then we can kind of unpack it and then create ecosystems that, ultimately support that.
Thank you for listening today. Remember to subscribe and share this podcast with a friend. And don't forget, the Impactful Parenting Podcast is an extension of the Impactful Parent community. Go to the Impactful Parent website and download the free Impactful Parent app so you don't miss a parenting tip that can help you and your family. Thanks for listening today. So go to theimpactfulparent.com and see you next episode.